Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we are finally going to be talking about the newest album from Regina Spektor, called Remember Us to Life. So here's the unfortunate truth of being a critic and also a human being. Like it or not, sometimes it's not just the art that overrules your critical faculties, but circumstances and memories that might be linked to that art. It might not just be the sound or a particular turn of phrase that sparks the emotion, it's the memories and the people and the events and the time associated with that sound or lyric or theme or song or album that renders our fragile objectivity all the more precarious. So case in point, about 4 years ago I was dating a girl who was very fond of Regina Spektor and encouraged me to check out her 2012 album What We Saw from the Cheap Seats. And while I had something of a mixed opinion on that album as a whole, when she and I broke up later that year, it became a bit difficult to go back to Regina Spektor without pulling up a lot of old memories. Not all bad or good memories, mind you, but fragments that place her music in a bit of an awkward context. And it's not helped by my frustrating relationship with Regina Spektor's peculiar brand of anti-folk itself. Earnest, frequently clever, with some striking melodies, but brimming at the edges with an off-kilter quirkiness that added personality, but could occasionally undercut the dramatic tension on some otherwise really potent songs. I've said in the past that I've got a very, very limited tolerance for twee, and while it didn't compromise her early 2000s work up to 2004 Soviet kitsch altogether, after that got kinda dicey. And what's frustrating is that it didn't happen all at once, or consistently. Begin to Hope actually had some emotionally poignant moments I really loved, especially that closing track, but it started to push it for me, especially if you start getting into the lyrics. And that awkward dichotomy between heartfelt power and cartoonish, artily garish quirkiness manifests the most on, you guessed it, What We Saw from the Cheap Seats. On the one hand, you would get powerhouse songs like All the Rowboats, but on the other hand, well, let's just say that besides that one song, I haven't had much of an impulse to go back to that record ever since. But hey, maybe this new album, which was supposedly a little bigger, a little darker, a little heavier, it might hit a more satisfying point for me. And I've always thought that Regina Spektor is an interesting songwriter, if not always a great one. She's got this penchant of adding in some random noises that just drives me off the wall, but whatever. How is Remember Us to Life? Well, honestly, for as much as so many critics describe this as a return to form from Regina Spektor, I was really skeptical going into this. But yeah, they're right in this case, because this is easily the most serious and grounded that she's been in years. And honestly, this album is really great because of that. There's still idiosyncratic elements, but there's a lot fewer of them that got on my nerves this time around. And this album seems tempered with the darker edge that feels fully unsheathed for the first time in years. Not just lyrically, but in the instrumentation and production as well. In other words, it looks like Regina Spektor honed in on the elements that I liked about What We Saw from the Cheap Seats and refined them into her strongest set of songs in years. In other words, a pretty damn great album that I really did enjoy. Now, before we get to the songwriting and themes, where I'll probably have a lot more to unpack, let's talk about Regina Spektor herself. And look, as much as I found her quirkier side kind of tiresome in the past, it's because it always seemed to detract from the fact that she's a great singer and performer when she does embrace more sincere, straightforward songs. Naturally expressive, thoughtful, vulnerable. She's always been clever, but here it feels more channeled to a more mature mode of delivery, minus some of the wonky vocal improvisations that some people really love, but it's always felt a quirk that's felt kind of vestigial at best for me. Always kind of got in the way. Again, your mileage might vary with this, but I suspect she dropped some of this so she could further emphasize how serious some of this subject matter is. But that's also very true with the instrumentation, as the tones have gotten significantly darker and colder and heavier. And no, not just because she brought her considerable ear for melody to bear on synthesizers that have the sort of richer, thicker tones that managed to fit in the mix pretty damn well, like on Small Bills, but also because she opted for a much fuller backing orchestra behind her, full of rich cellos and upright bass to accentuate a more elegant sort of opulence. Hell, even the piano melody, which remains the foundation of the majority of these songs, will occasionally feel the touch of atmospheric effects like the swirling laders on Tornadoland or the misty distance of Obsolete. And yet, to her credit, Regina Spektor never allows herself to get swallowed up by the mix or the reverb, and also isn't afraid to pull back the multi-tracking and swell to something more intimate or borderline mundane. The simple but jaunty foundational melody of Older and Taller is a fine example, strikingly reminiscent of Begin to Hope actually, but what caught my ear a lot more was the gentle twinkle enticing the adventure of Grand Hotel, or the muted soothing tones around the main piano melody of Delight, or the very tasteful intimacy of The Visit that I found really charming. Hell, while I might not be wildly tell about the thin gurgle of the tapping beat on Bleeding Heart that breaks into a borderline chiptune, and then a bridge that tries to go for these big blaring tones. The outro of that song, though, flat out gorgeous. It's really something beautiful. And that's not even touching the darkest tracks here, like The Trapper and the Furrier with its ominous grind of strings, or Sellers of Flowers that plays in even similar minor tones and even cadences to all the rowboats, and use those strings to crank up that ominous bombast. They're really potent songs. But for as much as I like the sound, the big test for me with Regina Spektor is always the songwriting. So what is she aiming to get at with Remember Us to Life? Well, remember how I referenced all the rowboats a number of times here? One of the underlying sources of tension in that song was stasis within time. It had the feel and tone of wandering through a museum, frozen in a moment, the violins and glass coffins unable to find life and sing. It was taking all those things outside of the flow of time. And yet, for as much tension as Spektor drew from artificially freezing time, she draws plenty more from living within it. Knowledgeable and in wonder of its past, like you see in the step-by-step journey down the well of Grand Hotel, trying to recapture an old-fashioned misadventure that, again, really charming. Also the very real fears of the future that come up on the very on-the-nose but effective social commentary on The Trapper and the Furrier, showing a system that will continue to feed those at the very top without question, while leaving those beneath them poor, sick, and unable to seek recourse. It makes trying to isolate those moments and pass things alone all the more difficult, especially if there is any desire to see legacy preserved. From her wish to pass along stories and dreams to her newborn son, even as old visions of the past slip away on the light, or to the musings of youth misspent on older and taller, as figures of her youth are confronted and seem more and less than what she originally remembered. Now, an album like this could very easily slip into wistful nostalgia, but Regina Spektor is a fair bit smarter than that. Half because she's all too aware of what could come ahead. Small Bill's a stark example of this, as in the presence of that casually misspent wealth, those on the desperate edge of poverty have a tendency to rise up and revolt, but half because she's also not afraid to confront the fact that time is gonna move on regardless, which is cemented in the final 3 songs, which are easily some of her best. Obsolete shows her in the position of one paralyzed at the edge, increasingly aware of irrelevance but unable to truly respond, but Sellers of Flowers is canny enough to not really have an easy answer for that blame. Not those who would repackage art to sell it, or those who would buy it and then forget it, or those who might never buy and never care, but maybe it's just the steady stretch of time that causes some art to fade out and never seems to flow at the speed that you would like it all that time. And that frustration lingers across this album, from wishing a friend would be able to reach out and heal from internal pain and depression faster on Bleeding Heart, or the impatience of Black and White to claim and process the pain. But then you go all the way to The Visit, the final song in this album, to a meeting with an old friend who always seemed to step outside of time, and a subtle acknowledgement that really the sense of time, it's a construct that we've built as a construct for our fears. And yet, there's a subtle trick of all. We only fear time because we can't control its passage. And anchoring our fears to its flow regardless, because it's going to keep flowing on, it obscures the beauty of those connections that truly never change and transcend time. The old friends that never quite seem to change. The moments that are, well, timeless. You know, it's funny. I opened this review talking about an old relationship and how it's tended to color how I view Regina Spektor, but the truth is that time has pushed that story forward, and with no ill will left there on my part, I'm left wondering what she'd say if she were to see this review. Because once you get to a certain age, you don't tend to change all that much. Maybe that's time's big trick for those who stride in step with time, but keep to their own path within it. In short, the more I've thought about and more I've written about Regina Spektor's Remember Us to Life, the more I've really come to appreciate its subtlety, its beauty, its atmosphere, and its real sense of maturity and wisdom, words I never thought I'd associate with Regina Spektor. As such, I'm confident giving this an 8 out of 10 and a very strong recommendation, folks. Regina Spektor, she's a damn great storyteller, and you can trust me when I say this, folks are going to remember this one, regardless of what time it might be. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe. I'll be more than grateful for that. I got the poll up here, so I'm actually curious where Regina Spektor fans fall on this, given that she's kind of evolving past some of her stylistic flourishes in the past, so there's your opportunity to rate it. Beyond that, if you guys have any opinions more there about my presentation, I'm happy to hear them. And if you guys want to influence whatever's left of my schedule before the end of the year, I've got my link to my Patreon right here. 3 times a week, you guys get a chance to vote on my schedule, and once a week on Saturdays, you guys get a chance in the higher Patreon levels to add albums to that schedule. Happy to have you guys on board, but until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.